Loading up. Make sure that it's not labeled as private because this is meant to be shared. There we go. Okay. All the pieces are in place. Well, such as it is. All right, we'll just give ourselves a moment breathing here. And yes, looking at the clock, I think it's fine to go ahead and begin. So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining me again as we continue our way through the book of Bereshit, and in particular at this time of year, as always, through the cycle of Jacob and into Joseph's life. We're going to begin right at the beginning of Parashat Vayeishev, chapter 37 of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. And unfortunately, with all of the turmoil that we had seen in last week's parasha, Vayishlach, we might have been hoping for Jacob and family to be able to settle down, but it is not to be. We have had painful parasha after painful parasha, from the strife within Jacob's home to the strife with the reunion with Esau, and then the terrible events of Dinah. Now, when everything should finally be settled, instead we're going to see strife in the next generation. It is not surprising, perhaps, that the children that came from the four different mothers are going to have many points of conflict, but it is important for us to unravel that. And as such, we're going to jump in here on chapter 1, where we begin to see some of those difficulties. Now, today I'm doing something a little different. As my regular students will know, I like to vary the way that we study so that people will recognize multiple styles. Today, what we're going to do is focus on one set of commentary. Now, it's not just because I like Rashba, although I do. It is because in this particular commentary, for this particular section of Torah, he makes a number of very important claims and gives a number of important instructions that are often in desperate need when we sit down to study Torah. Oftentimes, when we sit down to read the Torah, we are pulled in multiple directions. On the one hand, we might be just a modern style reader, that is to say, a consumer of literature. And this is a relatively modern mindset, to sit down, open up a book, to allow the words on the page to simply flow into your mind, to construct the narrative there, and to passively watch the story play out with nothing expected from the reader other than a reasonable attention to detail and a mostly decent memory, although even then, many authors will point out details they feel you need to see, and they will remind you of things that you might have forgotten. That is, as I say, a very modern style of writing, one afforded by not only the luxury of the printing press, but the cheap abundance of easy printing and now digital publishing that we live in. And I have nothing against it. I am a great lover of fiction and nonfiction written in this style. And it is a wonderful way to acquire information, to travel inside other people's stories and ideas. However, it is not the only way to read. And a modern reader that encounters the stories of Bereshit in particular, but really all of Tanakh, will come away feeling disoriented and dissatisfied with their journey through these texts, because they do not follow the rules of modern literature. The author is not holding you gently by the hand, leading you through each and every sentence and paragraph in a particular fashion to ensure that you have received entirely and in its fullness whatever the author's message was. This author, capital A author, is relying on a more active reader, a reader that will look through the text, look beneath the surface, try and actually explore what the words are and why they are, what words were chosen and what words were left off. This is an author that, quite frankly, respects the reader much more than most modern authors will. This is an author who takes us out of juvenile fiction and puts us firmly into a true conversation where I will not insult you by explaining everything in 18 layers of detail, because surely if you are paying attention and actually thinking, 1 or 2 sentences will be sufficient to generate the rest of my message. It, of course, means that this is easier to then remember, which was vastly more important in the ancient world when you couldn't count on an easy copy always being in your hand. It also meant that you would have much more ownership of the text as you engaged with it to unpack its ideas and mysteries. However, this then pulls us in the other of 2 directions. If the first is to be a complacent reader, to be a passive reader, simply sipping at whatever is poured by the author into our brain, the opposite, of course, is to be a more active and engaged reader than perhaps the author intended. There is a temptation, perhaps even just a propensity, to look at the text, knowing that we must be active, and then spinning much more out of the text than is truly legitimately found within the text. Now, none of us are in a perfect position to be able to say that any one interpretation may or may not be genuine to the text. Certainly, as anybody who has studied with me will know, I will often bring multiple diverse opinions, often mutually contradictory, that will demonstrate the flexibility of the text to teach us multiple things with only a few words. However, it is important to sometimes realize that while those additional explorations can be extremely fruitful and indeed have been the much of the muscle of our rabbinic tradition for the last 2,000 plus years, the skeleton is still essential, which is to say the text itself. Now, unfortunately, this idea of the text itself, or a, quote, literal or simple reading, a plain reading, has been overtaken in modern years by those who claim a fundamentalist perspective. That is not what I mean, nor classical Judaism means when talking about a peshat, or simple reading of the text. It means trying to understand the text on its own terms, within its own context, before applying another layer of analysis. It doesn't mean passive reading, and it doesn't mean a simplistic reading where whatever first occurs to me must be the, quote, true intent of the capital A author. Instead, it means a careful, thoughtful reading that nonetheless does not stray far from what with that thoughtfulness, clear meaning of the text would seem to be. Now, obviously, there's still much room for debate and discussion, even while pursuing this peshat, but as we'll see in Rashbam's commentary, it is, I think, important to continue to remind ourselves that we must pay careful attention to the peshat before we go into the drash, and God forbid we think that it is such a simple text that we err the other side and merely look at it superficially. Okay, that's a longer introduction than usual because I wanted to prime you up for this. So let's get down to work. We're only going to read the very beginning here from Parashat Vayeishev, chapter 37, verse 1. Yaakov settled in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. So Jacob is back. This is where Isaac had been. He is back here, and we are hoping for good news. And we get something like that. These are the begettings of Yaakov. These are the generations, toldot, a very common refrain used throughout this section of Torah. to discuss the story of a particular person vis-a-vis the archetypes of their family. Yosef, 17 years old, used to tend to the sheep along with his brothers. So we are now introduced to Yosef not just as the name of Rachel's first child, but as an individual himself. We're given a particular time. He is 17 years old, and we're even given something about his deeds. For he was a serving lad with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Yosef brought a report of them, an ill one, to their father. All right, again, incredibly dense text here on verse 2. This is not your average American fiction. This is expecting us to do a lot more of the heavy lifting here, and we will do so with the help of Rashbam when we go through. Now, Israel, that's Jacob's other son, you may remember from last week's Torah portion, loved Yosef above all his sons, for he was a son of old age to him. So he made him an ornamented tunic, the very famous cloak of many colors that was popularized in the musical. His brothers saw that it was he whom their father loved above all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him in peace. Here we hear the full repercussions of the strife. Notice so far we've already had two reasons for strife. The first being the ill reports of Joseph, and the second being the ornamental tunic. But of course, there is also the underlying question of the father's preferential treatment, and the underlying tension of what do we mean by Joseph hanging out, being with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives? Why that unusual phrasing? So on the surface, it seems like there are only two, but truly from the surface, we can see that there are at least four main issues happening here. And in order to truly drive home the division between Yosef and his brothers, we get our first dream here in verse 5. Yosef dreamt a dream and told it to his brothers. For then on, they hated him still more. All right, so the dream is apparently very problematic. What is it? He said to them, "Pray, hear this dream that I have dreamt. Now here we were binding sheaf bundles out in the field, and here my sheaf arose, and it was standing upright, and here your sheaves were circling around and bowing down to my sheaf." All right, you do not need to be a insightful dream interpreter to get the gist of what's probably going on in this dream with seeing the subservience of the brothers to Joseph. His brother said to him, "Would you be king? Yes, king over us? Or would you really rule, yes, rule over us?" From then on, they hated him still more for his dreams, for his words. All right. So again, we can see in Fox's lovely translation a bit more of the poetry that happens in these phrases. But he dreamt still another dream and recounted it to his brothers. He said, "Here, I have dreamt still another dream. Now here the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he recounted it to his father and his brothers, here his father is introduced, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you have dreamt? Shall we come, yes, come, I, your mother and your brothers, to bow down to you to the ground?" His brothers envied him, while his father kept the matter in mind. All right, we're going to leave that there because in verse 12 onward, we're going to end up with the near death and then exile of Joseph, and that's a much longer tale that we touched on at other times. So we have this introduction of the relationship between Joseph and his brothers and between Jacob and his sons. And this relationship could, if we were very casual readers, seem rather obvious. That Jacob favored one of his sons, that son was a little bit of a jerk, the other brothers hate him, and, things are going to happen. But really, there's much more going on in all of this. In fact, there's much more going on even just with that early introduction of Yaakov, Yosef, and the other brothers. And it is that we are going to unpack. Before we duck over to the commentary page, are there any questions not just about the major commentary themes that I've already hinted at. All right, not seeing anybody. Let's go ahead then and jump into Rashbam's explanation. I think we can make that one bigger. There we go. Always try to make it as large as I can and still fit on the screen for those of you that are using a small screen to study together. Those who love pure reason. All right, Rashbam, off to a very good start. It is often overemphasized that the modern world is the rational and that the medieval world was irrational. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I would say that both now and then people were of relatively equal mix of being rational and irrational. But what Rashbam is saying here is that we need to be careful when we are studying the text, and that if you are truly trying to examine this rigorously and carefully, that there is an element that is far too often, in his opinion, overlooked. So those who love pure reason should always remember that the sages, that's the Chachamim of antiquity, have said a biblical passage must not be deprived of its plain meaning. The Hebrew word there being peshat. So what they mean by this is that it is fine and indeed encouraged to engage in different types of analysis, exegesis, what we often call midrash and other forms of explanation. But no matter how far you wish to wander, you must be sure that it does not do irreparable damage to the actual peshat, the plain meaning of the text. If it subverts and makes a mockery of the text around it, then while it might be an interesting homiletical exercise, it's not truly a legitimate interpretation of the text. Saying black is white and white is black and up is down and down is up. There are some very clever ways that you can make those sorts of claims, but if they actually do irreparable harm to the peshat, the true in context meaning of that phrase, then it's not a correct interpretation. It doesn't mean it can't be insightful, and indeed the intellectual process can be stimulating, but we are not at liberty to invent any meaning from the text. There still needs to be an allegiance to the peshat to some degree, which means we have to actually find out what that peshat is. We can't take it as read, that just I read the sentence, therefore I know. It does take some investigation. Because the main point of Torah comes to teach us and to tell us in hints found in the plain meaning of the text, the Haggadot and Halachot and laws derived through the lengthy words, and the 32 and 13 laws by which we derive law from the text of the Torah. Right, we need to get this pshat in order to understand what it is hinting at. Now, hint here does not mean the clues of Sherlock Holmes. Hint here means that there are clear insights from the Torah, but that they are not made grossly explicit in the text. Again, like I said at the very beginning of today's study, the Torah expects you to work. It feels that what it said was clear enough, but it's only clear enough if you're willing to rub a few neurons together. And those are the hints. There's something there, there's something unusual, there's something that grabbed my attention. Now I need to investigate it. That is still peshat, right? That's still a plain meaning of the text. That is not going beyond the plain meanings of the text yet until we get into other layers of interpretation. The Rishonim, because of their piety, busied themselves with the Drashot as their focus. Rishonim, again, is the technical term for the earlier sages, meaning the ones that were from after the time of the Talmud, but in this case, before the time of Rashbam, although nowadays we generally consider anyone to be a Rishonim from after the Geonim, which were the first generation of the Talmud, although even those can sometimes be classified as Rishonim, all the way up until the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch, which is around the 1500s. So those are the early ones, if you will. Now, because of their piety, he says, they focused on the Drashot. Right? They wanted to plumb the depths, because for them the Peshat was generally clear, it was understood, and thus their works, their studies were looking at other levels. Because of their great piety, they already had that base level, they could delve deeper. And they did not regularly delve into the plain meaning of the text. And because the Chachamim, again, those are the sages from antiquity, said not to spend too much time with logic and express the significance not of learning Torah, but of learning Talmud as having no greater measure, they did not regularly engage in establishing the plain meaning of the text. So, and we have to also recognize, says Rashbam, perhaps with a little bit of trepidation, that the majority of our time for the last, at this point, about 1,000 years, has been spent with analysis of the Talmud in order that we could understand the halacha, the actual way we are meant to live, the do's and don'ts of the mitzvot in all of their details and all their applications. It means that there hasn't been a regular amount of study set aside to explicate the peshat, the plain meaning of the text. Everyone raced to the conclusion, if you will, or the implementation of the text, and didn't stop to actually look at, well, what does the text mean just by itself, regardless of the halachic analysis that comes later. Even Rashi, the father of my mother, a good reminder that Rashbam is Rashi's grandson, in establishing, of my mother, set his heart to explain the plain meaning of the text. Even my grandfather Shlomo, that's Rashi's first name, was an adherent of this school. And I had an argument with him on that account, in which he admitted that he would make new commentaries according to the plain meanings that arise each day. So Rashbam is giving a little bit of a peek into the family dynamic, and he is hinting that he complained to his grandfather, who had made the most famous anthology of commentary up to that point, and still is considered to be the backbone of Torah scholarship today, that although Rashi said that he wanted to write a Peshat interpretation of Torah, a lot of what Rashi did was not a Peshat interpretation of Torah, but instead was an anthology of rabbinic drash, of more midrashic understanding, oftentimes not thoroughly explaining the actual Peshat before jumping into the midrashic explanations. And Rashbam is saying that he had a conversation with Rashi, and they argued, and Rashi agreed that, you know what, you're right. I never completed truly the task just of the Peshat. I kind of got sidetracked by all the midrash. And if I could do it again, says Rashi, I would be focused on doing a more Peshat form of study. So, let's actually go ahead and begin to put that into place, says Rashbam. What would it look like to do a thorough Peshat analysis, in this case, of this particular passage of the Torah? So the first thing he's going to do is bring a quote from his grandfather, from Rashi, and then he's going to reject it. Now, this is the commentary that Rashi brings for our very first sentence in this parasha, which is, Yaakov settled in the land of his father's sojournings, in the land of Canaan. These are the begettings of Yaakov. Ela toldot, right? What's going on here? According to Rashi, these are their settlements and the events that happened to them until they formed a permanent settlement. So why is it being written that this is an idea of settling and of lack of permanence? Well, because Rashi feels that that is what we must interpret this phrase for in context, because clearly that's the overarching goal that this text is coming to tell us. Rashbam disagrees. This exegesis is nonsense. Wherever the expression toldot, ela toldot, these are the generations, these are the begetting, occurs in the Bible, sometimes this word introduces the names of grandsons of the party referred to, such as in Genesis 6:9, where the Torah, after describing the righteousness of Noach, tells us that Noach had 3 sons and proceeds to give us their names. The names of the sons could not be the purpose of the story there, as we had been told about them earlier in chapter 5, verse 32. Okay, so let's make sure that we're understanding here, because Rashbam is taking Rashi to task because he doesn't feel that Rashi has properly expanded upon the true Peshat, the true plain meaning of what this text, Ela Toldot, is really trying to tell us in this part of the Torah. Yes, it could just be, this is the story of, and during a certain time, which is why it's called Vayeishev. It could be that, but that doesn't actually feel very in-depth. That feels indeed very superficial, which, as I said before, is not the same as pshat or straightforward. Instead, let us understand that sometimes when we get the word toldot, it describes a list of the people, but the list of the people is not the purpose of that list, because like we see here in Genesis 6 and 5, the names of those people actually had already been shared. So why bring it here? Again, there's a basic assumption under any Torah scholarship that the Torah does not unnecessarily repeat things. So we can't say the Torah just brought it a second time because it thought it would be fun. The Torah then continues, now to give us a reasoning, the Torah then continues to describe mankind's ongoing corruption and that Noah was the only one with whom God was pleased. When the Torah commences a second time in chapter 6:9, it is telling us of Noah's grandchildren. Just as the Torah reported the growth and development of mankind after the deluge, until we have a total of 70 such descendants of Noah being named, so in chapter 36:6, we have been told of the descendants of Esau, who have been born in the land of Canaan, the land in which their father lived. The Torah reports the development of Yaakov's family in a parallel manner, 35:23, extending through verses 26 and 27, and listing all his children who had been born in exile, while he was in Padam Aram with Lavan. All right, let's make sure that we're following this. And I swear to you that Rashbam is trying to make it clear that this is what the clear reading must entail. Notice, this does not mean I just read a verse and then I think about what it means. I have to read a verse, check its context, check parallel texts, check usages of the word in other places. That's what Peshat meaning is. It is not just what do I think it means by reading it today. And what do we see? Well, we see a pattern where a generation can be listed a couple times. The first time, perhaps, is best described as being, here are the names. And the second time is often to give a very important context. And lo and behold, by doing that multiple times in a similar fashion, we are also generating a certain pattern of expectation, that when we get a set of names, we should expect a parallel set coming later, and that parallel set will be teaching us something new and novel about the particular group or time in which we are focused on. So we've had Noah, we've had Esau, and now we're getting Jacob and his family's turn. So now the Torah continues with the words Ela Toldot, excuse me, don't know why that popped up. Ela Toldot Yaakov, these are the generations, these are the begettings of Yaakov, concentrating forthwith on the grandchildren who combined to make up a total of 70 prior to the descendants of the family to Egypt. So just like we saw back in Noah, now we're getting another 70. Now you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, what grandchildren? We just talked about Joseph. We just talked about the brothers. That's the sons, not the grandsons. Where is the 70? Well, Rashbam is taking the big view, which is that this section of the story has a particular goal that is foreshadowed by the use of the words Ela Toldot, which is not to tell us the sons, because we know their names, but is to tell us about the extent of the family, which will, of course, end up being 70, because 70 is a beautiful archetypical number, as we've already seen back in Noah. So, details of the birth of these various grandchildren are being provided, beginning with the chronicle of what happened to Joseph, who at 17 years of age experienced traumatic events, as a result of which his older brother Yehuda separated from the other brothers and started his own family in Ketziv and Adulam, siring 3 sons and grandsons, respectively, Shelah, Peretz, and Zerach. Okay, so we're beginning to see now where Rashbam is going with this idea, that we should be looking out through this section of the generations of Yaakov, not just for what happened to his kids, but in particular, how what happened to his kids led to the expanding, unfolding, and eventual placement of his grandchildren, of that next generation, and how, of course, it will eventually total 70, paralleling Noah, paralleling that group of survivors, if you will, who were after the hardship of the flood, and now we're going to get survivors who end up in the crucible of Egypt. So there's a literary parallelism here that is very strong, and which is baked into the simple reading of the text. Again, I cannot emphasize that enough, and I know that I'm fighting against the tides of modern readership, but a simple reading does not mean a childish reading. It does not mean a superficial reading. It means taking the texts at face value, based upon the style that of the way it was written, and connected to parallel styles elsewhere, and what that could mean for what the text is trying to tell the observant, the interested, the thoughtful, logical, rational reader. And this is something that Rashbam believes that we should be picking up on, but it is likely that we might have missed it, because after all, we are pulling from 3 different stories, and thus he wants to explicate it so that a thoughtful reader will have it drawn to their attention, and then they'll be able to understand more of what the peshat, the straightforward meaning of the text, is meant to be. Now, the history of Yaakov's family became complicated further, with Yosef having been brought to Egypt as a slave, where Menashe and Ephraim, 2 more grandchildren, were born for him. Having attained high office, Yosef invited his father and family to join him in Egypt, so that ultimately 70 members of Yaakov's family wound up in Egypt. Moses had to record all this in order to substantiate his claim in Deuteronomy 10:22 that your fathers descended to Egypt when they numbered only 70 persons. So Rashbam is taking the larger view, something that we often forget to do unless the author tells us to in modern readings, which is that when we're reading the story of Joseph here, we can't just think of it as being an interesting story that would make a fun musical that would eventually be on stage in the 20th century. Instead, we have to be saying, why is the Torah bothering to bring this information to me? Why would Moses bother to record this? Remember, there were countless events and activities that happened to all of these families prior to Moses eventually setting down the Torah. Yet Moses chose to record some of them. Now, Moses could have recorded many of these different passages much more succinctly. Indeed, he does record many passages very succinctly. When we get into more expanded discussion, we have to be alert to the hints, the clues, the technical terminology, which is trying to explain to us why it was bothered to be saved, why it was recorded from the family history. And in this particular case, it is in order to provide a framework, first for the 70 that will be going down, but then to also provide that ultimate arc of why were we in Egypt and what was happening in that process that would eventually lead to the Exodus, and then, of course, the ultimate point, the actual giving and receiving of the Torah. All of that is encapsulated in Ela Toldot, says Rashbam, if you're willing to read it straightforward, without either being too superficial or without jumping straight into the various drashot and interpretations and homilies that may be very interesting, but unfortunately might mean you miss the intricate and tight literary style found here. Okay, let me take a little sip of tea, because that was a long bit of monologuing. And then let's carry on with Rashbam's analysis of this rest of this section, because as we'll see, we're not done yet with understanding the straightforward pshat, the plain meaning of the text. Stating his age, remember that he was 17, was necessary. Again, we have to be a good analyst. Why did it bother to tell us how old it was, how old he was? I mean, after all, we don't hear how old many people are when they do different things. Occasionally, yes, oftentimes not. When it happens, we should notice. And that's not a place that we just jump to a drush. It means we should notice, even within the plain meaning of the text, the peshat, why it's happening. It was necessary so that we realize the separation of Yosef from his father, during which time Yaakov had considered his son as dead, lasted for 22 years. The Torah testifies in 41:26 that Yosef was 30 years old when presented to Pharaoh, after which time 7 good years and 2 years of famine occurred before Yaakov and family descended to settle in Egypt, making a total of 22 years of separation. So we needed to have this total number of separation to understand the strife and heartbreak. Incidentally, we also needed the 17 because there would be 17 prior to his enslavement, and then there would be 17 years of reunification between Yaakov and his father, Joseph, his son, at the end of the story. So it does also provide a numerical bookend that way. But we needed to be clear how long this actually was. Was Yosef down there just for a little bit? If we had just begun with 30, as when he was presented to Pharaoh, we wouldn't know whether or not he had been taken when he was 2 or whether when he was 22. So we needed to have a proper start point in order to be able to do the math correctly and understand the true situation. Likewise, the sons of Leah are referred to as his brothers, seeing that they were the sons of a major wife, as opposed to the sons of Zilpah and Bilhah, who ranked lower on the social scale, though also half-brothers of Yosef. They are therefore referred to here only as the sons for their respective mothers. Again, a close and careful reading will notice, and let's go back just so I can put the mouse over the top of it and point it out, that when it says that he is spending time with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, that it is a choice, a stylistic decision by the text to not call them his brothers, but to call them the sons of his father's wives. This is intentional because it does describe in a peshat way that there was something different in his relationship with them than his relationships with the children of Leah, and of course the one other child that was from Rachel, the only other, quote, full brother that he had. And that those small terminology changes were not just an accident of composition. That is an authorial choice. He spent most of his time in the company of those 4 children, the children of Bilhah and Zilpah, who were far closer to him in age, being the ones that were the later born children, after Leah had had her first few and then stopped, and then we finally see the others being born, and then Joseph coming later, that Joseph would have been much closer to them than he would have been to the first children of Leah. So the fact that Joseph preferred the company of the sons of the servant maids may have been the beginning of the sons of Leah resenting him. So we see here that this is another important aspect that if we were just reading casually would not have been clear to us, that his relationship to the sons of Leah, the other senior wife, was strained because he was perhaps naturally drawn to the company of his brothers that were closer in age, that were from the handmaids. That is something that is clear when we stop and analyze the peshat, but not something that is necessarily going through additional layers of midrashic analysis. Again, Rashbam is giving us a helping understanding of peshat here. So let's continue using peshat. And again, we're still all in that same verse. He was tending the sheep with his brothers, but seeing that he still enjoyed his carefree childhood, he spent most of his time with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, right? Instead of those in the company of the sons of Leah. Again, the text is very clear, although odd, because it's drawing our attention to it if we pay attention, that he was a serving lad, this Na'ar, with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. And then we go on later on to find out that he is supposed to be joining them in Shechem in verse 12. So there is this disconnect between perhaps what his job is supposed to be and perhaps what his job is, or his activities are by himself. As a 17-year-old, he should have acted like a Na'ar, an adolescent lad approaching manhood. This is a statement that he should have been more mature. He should have been weaning himself from the casualness of childhood, and instead should have been embracing the responsibilities of adulthood more and more as adulthood in its full form was approaching. This is the meaning of the word in Hosea and Samuel, 2 Samuel, meaning the term of Na'ar. Na'ar does not mean a immature child. It means a maturing child. And the Torah now enumerates a number of other causes which contributed to the brothers hating Yosef. So this usage of the term Na'ar is not accidental. It is trying to tell us what he should be, and yet his actions are telling us that he is not yet there. Again, this is breeding resentment. If you have a favorite son that is not even acting like a proper, mature member of the household for his age, he's not truly being a Na'ar, then we can understand even more what's coming later. And again, this whole section, as we discussed in the earlier parts of Rashbam's commentary, is designed to tell us not just the family drama. This is not just a reality TV show for our excitement and titillation. This is trying to tell us how it is that everybody ends up where they end up, and the next generation is created as they are created. And then we finally finish off our section that Rashbam is leading us through. The language is somewhat inverted regarding the reports, and means the same as he brought reports of his brother's wrongdoing. So if we go back and look at the Torah section here at the bottom, this idea of dibatam, is a little bit unclear within the text itself of what exactly it is. What is this this noun that he is bringing, this bad thing? And the translation has already accepted this as being Peshat, that it is a type of report, a type of message. This is in line with the interpretation of Vayeishev Rabbah, as quoted by Rashi, Rashbam's granddad, that Yosef told his father that the sons of Leah treated the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah with disdain. So we look back again, and we can see that we might have thought that Yosef brought a bad report of them, meaning that it was a bad report about Bilhah and Zilpah. But instead, if we read this more carefully, we can see that he brought a bad report concerning them, meaning a report of something bad related to them, meaning it was not Bilhah and Zilpah's children that were having the major problem. It was the sons of Leah that had a problem with Bilhah and Zilpah, that it was the senior wives, in terms of children, senior sons, that were treating the sons of the handmaidens improperly. And that is what he brought. And by context, Rashbam argues, he contrasted this with his own behavior towards these half-brothers of him, whom he professed to honor and spend extra time with as proof of his considering them equal. Other commentators have not related to the principal meaning of our verse. So others, yes, talk about some of these ideas tangentially, but they get into other issues that are much more midrashic. Whereas Rashbam is saying, we look carefully at the construction of these verses, and we analyze it according to their context, according to what we know will eventually be stated in the Torah as happening, and according to the general pattern of how terms and words are used in the Torah in other similar circumstances, then we can come to an understanding of this that is not a flight of fancy, that is not stretching ourselves to make an exegesis in order to provide additional moral instruction or historical interpretation of events that were more contemporaneous with the later rabbis or the commentaries of the Middle Ages. Instead, we can see Peshat, what the Torah itself was trying for us to get, at least on that plain level, from the text itself. As I said at the outset, a Peshat reading, a plain reading, is not an easy reading. It is not a casual reading. It is not a reading that is going to be simply inspired by the first stirrings of my interpretations. it is a reading that takes serious, strict consideration of what the words can be said to mean simply by themselves. The rest can be argued. The rest can be expanded and discussed and debated. But we do need, says Rashbam, to understand what the text itself was trying to say in a way that is not subject to much debate and discussion once we have clarified. Obviously, there's always going to be some debate and discussion because that's what studying is. But we should be able to at least understand it on its own terms before beginning to delve into other layers. And Rashbam, as you can see, is frustrated that not enough time is being spent on that layer. Now, I share his frustration, but I also share the temptation to ignore his warnings. It is very tempting to want to dive into the deeper levels of the midrashic and halachic interpretations, because those are things that will both inspire us as well as guide us in a practical way. Day in, day out, remembering different stories as interpreted through midrash or halacha gives us very clear signposts of what we're supposed to do. What Rashbam is saying here is that, yes, that's well and good and desirable, but don't neglect the Torah itself. The Torah is not just a springboard, it's not just a portal through which we enter some other realm of understanding and action. It is that, but it is also a thing which deserves to be examined for its own beauty and its own structure in and of itself. And that's not only because of its objective greatness as literature and as text, but because only by understanding that plain Peshat meaning clearly and strongly can we be sure that other interpretations are actually anchored in the Torah, and that we are not just inventing things that we would like to be true, that are perhaps inspired to us by our reading, but truly are not a legitimate conclusion to draw from any particular passage. So it is a safeguard against those flights of fancy and digressions, as well as a proper appreciation for the beautiful gift that God gave us in the Torah itself. And we'll finish there unless there are questions or comments that people would like to share. All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions or comments. A few welcome shaloms from some people in the YouTube chat, and indeed, it would be lovely to study in person. It's always nice to be live, at least this way, or any other way that we can possibly make it work. And let's continue to study together as often as we can. So I hope everybody is well, continues to study, and I will see you next time. Be well. Got to find the right button on my Zoom. Where's my Zoom? There we are.